So I think with that confirmation, we can now move formally to our panel discussion. I've already introduced Honourable Tracey Martin. Thank you very much for stepping in the Minister's stead and fielding the last questions. There may be a few more for you yet, but we have a panel of four speakers. The first one is going to be Melissa Lee. Melissa is been a national MP since 2008. She's the opposition spokesperson for broadcasting media, digital economics and communications, and ethnic communities. And she was previously a journalist at the Sunday News and producer for the television program Asia Down Under. So a very warm welcome to Melissa. Dr. Gavin Ellis is also joining us. Many of you will know Gavin as the former editor-in-chief at the New Zealand Herald. He was also a former senior lecturer in film, media and television at Auckland University. Of course, he's a regular media commentator, and he's also author of the Nightly News blog. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Trisha Dunleavy, my own colleague here at Te Herangawaka, is an associate professor in media and communication, who helped actually found our media studies program. She's the author of numerous publications, including several books, focusing mainly on television drama and most recently multi-platform television. And Trisha also served on the Strong Public Media Governance Group. So we have a tremendous lineup of knowledgeable experts. And so what I'd like to do is introduce, invite each of our experts in turn just to take a couple of minutes to respond to the themes that the Minister introduced, perhaps to comment on whether or not they support or find issues with the proposals that are currently on the table. And then we'll move to a Q&A session in pretty much the same format. Melissa was the first off the rank as the opposition spokesperson. So Melissa, would you care to make a comment?
Well, thank you so much for the invitation to participate, and it was really interesting to listen to the Minister. But I'm still a little bit baffled as to what exactly is the funding. Although the budget announced was 327 million for the next 4 years, and he actually said that his government is actually going to be funding half of the revenue, which is 200 million of Crown funding, but he went down to the 109 million a year. So how is the 200 million going to be funded from the Crown when he's actually saying 109 million? So perhaps Tracey could actually answer some of that. Because when the budget was actually announced, I was trying to figure out exactly how much more is actually dedicated to the new entity, considering the fact that even TVNZ currently now has New Zealand on air funding of close to $50 million. Radio New Zealand gets close to $50 million. So that's already $100 million. And if you only are funding, as the Minister said, 109 million a year, it's only 9 million more. So, and they're supposed to operate as a not-for-profit and mixed funding model. And you've also got this whole establishment cost of a new entity. And when he actually goes to say that we currently have great and strong independent media, strong public media, if that's the case, what's broken that he has to create a new, Leviathan that actually, potentially could, stump out the commercial media entity? And I've also sort of, in my own way, engaging with the other stakeholders, when this whole thing actually began, going right back to, when I first became the broadcasting spokesperson. But, he talks about Public Interest Journalism Fund. I think one of the biggest criticism of Public Interest Journalism Fund was the fact that the trust factor in media has actually dropped as a result of it, because government was funding journalism. And because of the way that it was actually designed in terms of New Zealand On Air, putting specific parameters of the funding, even the media themselves are actually now having second thoughts as to whether they will continue to actually apply for the funding. And there were many entities who never got the funding, particularly from the ethnic communities media sector. So I'm actually pleased to actually hear that the Minister is actually focusing on the future of New Zealand, because I think we all need to think about that. and how, I want to have local content on our television and radio. I've always been a champion of local content. And I just wonder, was there a better way that we could have actually spent public money instead of creating a new infrastructure to deliver the content than actually creating this new media entity? So I look forward to the discussions.
Thank you very much, Melissa. Tracey was next on our list, so I've already introduced Tracey, so the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. Just to answer Melissa's question, so it's $109 million a year in new money, but there's $91 million a year sitting in the appropriation and the broadcasting and media appropriation right now. So if you add those two together, there's your 200 million. Just the other thing too is it is a little disconcerting that people still articulate that they don't know what the problem is. And so I do highly recommend the business case, the BCG's report that was given to the minister with dependencies, and also the cabinet paper that created the entity, which also carries the recommendations for the charter in it. Like Melissa, I went around as the chair of the BCG, the business case group, and spoke to 64 commercial entities throughout New Zealand, spoke to multitudes of individuals who are inside the content production and inside the sector. There's actually nobody inside the sector that says that they don't need assistance. There's nobody inside the sector that doesn't recognise that the ecosystem of media has changed dramatically, and it's changed not just dramatically in the last decade, but in the last couple of years it has sped up. And I think that what people thought were solutions only say 6 months ago, let's take Netflix, that shifting everything onto a subscription site has shown that there is no silver bullet to how a country needs to manage and resource its public media to ensure, particularly small countries like New Zealand, that our people can still hear themselves, see themselves, get to know each other better. So it's about that social cohesion, that those who are currently disengaged or underserved are able to be better served. And that's the point of what we are doing. And that's why we're doing it. This is actually not about that the current media entities are doing anything wrong. Trust is dropping across the world in media entities. Disinformation and misinformation is growing, and it's being deliberately grown. So what we have, luckily, however, in New Zealand, we still have a large proportion of our population who understands and trusts public media. Now is the time to make sure that we support the two existing entities through bringing them together, not together, but bringing them underneath what is a well-resourced public media entity with a mandate to actually support the whole of the ecosystem. Now is the time to do it before the crisis gets worse. And we're actually taking on international Goliaths here. We are the David inside a David and Goliath battle for the ecosystem of New Zealand media. So this entity, and I'm starting back on the road to go and talk to the commercial entities and make sure that they understand that this entity has a responsibility to help them stay inside and do business and be successful inside New Zealand, just as much as it needs to make sure that the dedicated public media service funded by the New Zealand taxpayer is successful and delivering for all New Zealanders across New Zealand. That's something this entity has to do. But I'll leave it there, and perhaps questions would be better later on.
Thank you very much indeed, Tracey. We'll move on to Dr. Gavin Ellis. I think I mentioned Dr. Gavin Ellis is the former editor-in-chief at the New Zealand Herald, former senior lecturer in film, media and television at Auckland University, and a regular media commentator. So Gavin, would you care to give us an overview of your response to the Minister's position?
Thank you, Peter. Let me start by saying that I am a strong supporter of the new entity. I think that it's an idea whose time came some time ago. I, in fact, see an extraordinary opportunity to create a world first organisation that is built from the ground up for the digital age. It doesn't owe anything to the past, but owes everything to the future. Having said that, I have some very, very real concerns about the way it is developing. Now, I have to say that's not a criticism of Tracey or the establishment board. It's a matter of process. On Nightly Views this week, I said that the project had become, and I'm stealing, of course, from Winston Churchill, a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma, because there are so many questions that have yet to be answered. Now, I know the establishment board has the mandate to ask and answer many of those questions, but in parallel, we also already have the development of draft legislation that will have to, at least in its first iteration, will have to be on the ground within a matter of 2 or 3 months, I think, at the most. Now, we therefore have something of a disconnect. If we have all of these unanswered questions, but a bill that is being written already, there is a disconnect there. And I do hope that the establishment board will have the power to dictate some of the directions in which that legislation goes. Now, I know ultimately it's in the hands of Parliament, but I think that there is an awful lot of work yet to be done on that. And I have concerns, for example, about structure. I have no idea what the structure of this entity is going to be like. I fear that it's going to have 2 divisions that will have different names, but in fact will be Radio New Zealand and Television New Zealand. If it does that, it's failed. I also have concerns about governance. This entity will be monitored by more state agencies than ever before. Ever before. There are at least 4 and as many as 6 that will have some form of oversight into what it's doing. Now, this is at a time when trust in media and trust in government is at an all-time low. If we don't do something to ensure the absolute independence of this entity from any forms of government control over and above annual appropriations of funding for public good, then it will not gain the trust of the public. It must have an independent governance structure. Miles asked the question about monitoring. I believe that it has to have not just a monitor, but a guardian. I think there has to be a body that sits above the board that ensures that what it stands for and what it can achieve has a champion. I don't think it should report to the executive. I think it should only report to Parliament as a whole. All sorts of questions like that I think will be necessary in order for it to regain the trust of the public of New Zealand. Look at what the Disinformation Project report came out with last week, where during the protest at Parliament, the number of people who went to disinformation sources outnumbered those who went to mainstream media for news about the protest. Now, that is deeply worrying. We've got a lot of work to do to ensure that that trust element is at the fore in this entity, but it must be seen to be done.
Thank you very much indeed, Gavin. And then last but not least, Dr. Trisha Dunleavy from Te Herenga Waika.
Kia ora koutou. Sorry for the delay there. Really great to see all of you, and some of you I know very well, and I'm glad to see you again as well. Really neat that you're all here. And I'm I'm actually excited that this is happening. I have to say, I will respond to you, Gavin, but I'm very, very excited that we're finally here, that we're actually talking about this. There's money being devoted to this. There's been a year of planning, careful work by the BCG, which I was part of. A huge amount of consultation occurred during that time. I have to say, we were talking to young people, we were talking to industry, we were talking to different underserved groups in New Zealand in terms of public media. So we actually have already closely gauged public opinion on this and taken all of those views into account. We've also got those views have fed into the shape of the charter that has been developed so far. So there's been an awful lot of consultation already. So to those of you that are concerned that you haven't been consulted with enough, I would say there has been opportunity to be consulted. There will be more opportunities. And in the end, we cannot develop this entity in collaboration with the New Zealand public. So there's a limited amount of consultation that anyone could be expected to do in creating something like a new public media entity. I want to say something, a word that hasn't been used yet, and the word is, I can see Melissa's hand up already. I haven't even said anything yet. So I'd love to say a few things, Melissa, first, if that's okay. The word that comes to mind is broadcasting, and I know it's an old-fashioned word, and we are in a multi-platform era. And I know what I mean by that. When I talk about multi-platform, I'm talking about old platforms. I'm also talking about new platforms, and the major addition has been the internet. And some of the structural concerns that Gavin raised are going to be addressed by this idea of a multi-platform entity, actually, because there is going to be a body overseeing the activities of the entity. So it's not as if there is no oversight or there's too much. The oversight will begin inside the entity, at the head of the entity. And of course, the services, Gavin alluded to a large degree of discontinuity. And I really think there's been an effort to make sure there is a certain degree of continuity. It's a dangerous thing in a highly competitive, multi-platform media environment, such as the one we're in, to start really seriously mucking about with trusted, long-standing brands. So we've paid quite significant attention to that in terms of the design of the new entity. Now, the map, the plan, the visual sort of visualization, if you like, of the entity is in the business case, if you'd like to have a look at it. There are many unanswered questions. Of course there are. There must be the freedom for the establishing board and then the board itself to make decisions as they go along, to react to changing circumstances. But nonetheless, I'm very excited because I feel, and I agree with everyone that said that they support it, that things have to happen now. It's already, in a sense, far too late for us to be trying to rebuild our public media. But I'm thrilled that the government has allowed this to happen. I'm delighted to see the money has been provided. There is a certain degree of new money in there, and we need to see the new money. But the other thing about this, for the people who've asked about the new money and the size of it, is not every decision about money has been made. We've got into an establishing phase. We've got the money for that. Let's be grateful for that and know that that's enough to do what's proposed for the next 3 years. But we need more money. We will be arguing for more money. The minister did talk about the budget, future budgets, so we can expect a little more. I'm excited that New Zealand On Air and the new entity will be able to work together. But more than anything else, we simply have only one chance, it seems to me. We are in, as Tracey said, we are in a situation of Goliaths descending upon New Zealand in the form of mostly US-owned premium providers delivering television, film, and music. These are bringing in entertainment. This will mean increasingly that the kind of ways in which we've been delivering our television, for instance, cannot continue. They simply will not continue. We'll need more local content than ever before, because we won't be able to buy the imported content that we literally had access to before. There are so many things to say. I don't really think I can really say them all, so I better sort of sign off, I guess, and take questions. But really, I want to go back to just finally Chris's point, that younger people are leaving public media. They have deserted it already. We really have to act now, and we really have to provide public media for them. So it's not just what we want, what we'd like to see, even though that's being preserved and protected. It's what they need and they need to have going forward. We need something that we can take forward into the next 20, 30 years, not just the next electoral cycle. All right. And that's what we've been working on. So I guess that's all I can kind of say for now, but I've got a lot more there. So thank you.
Super. Well, thank you very much to Trisha and indeed all our panelists for their immediate response. Sorry, I see Melissa's had her hand up. I think she wanted to reply to something Tracey said earlier. So Melissa, feel free to respond.
Thank you. And Trisha, it wasn't actually you that I was actually responding to, but I will do that. The question that and a comment that I actually had in relation to what Tracey actually said in terms of the consultation was that it seems ironic that, there was a superior report which was commissioned by the MCH, which was completely ignored. I mean, it actually said there was no issue of plurality in our media. And there were a whole lot of other things that actually said. I mean, most of you probably would have actually read it. But I just felt that, when you are consulting, you have to take the good with the bad. And it felt like criticism about what was actually happening was actually completely ignored, and even MCH even tried to change the website, trying to distance itself from it. So I just wanted to make a comment about that. And I'm really happy to see the passion in Trisha and Tracey. And I have to say, when Tracey actually said that there were lots of engagement, it is a bit surprising. She was the only person who reached out to me over the last 5 years. Where I have actually put my hand out to the minister, and I, right from the beginning, when the new minister, as in Minister Fafoy, was appointed as the minister, and before that Claire Curran, I, as the opposition spokesperson, have always said, hey, I'm passionate about local content, I'm passionate about broadcasting as a former journalist and a broadcaster. If it is a good idea, I will definitely support. I would actually love to be engaged in the process and the discussion. I have not been consulted. Tracey was the only person who came and saw me that one time when she was
hoping to come and see you again.
I'm giving you a compliment.
I know.
That one time you were the only one who has actually come to my office to have a conversation, and that was the only time. And I'm a little bit concerned that we have decision. You talk about public consultation. And it seems like the decisions have already been made, the charter's already half written, and we're going into a process where people only get to sort of have a discussion at select committee. I mean, select committee is a very poor representation of the public in a lot of ways, and I just worry about it. I mean, look, as I said right from the beginning, I'm a supporter of local content. I want to do, I want to make sure our children grow up with New Zealand content. I want to see New Zealanders on screen. But, as there are lots of underserved and unserved communities, as you know, Tracey, and I've been really, really passionate about that. And they still did not get that look in, even with a public interest journalism fund. And I don't know what the new public media entity will actually do in terms of how they're going to do it.
Yeah, I mean, let's pick up on that, because I think it's a really good point. I don't know anything about the Public Interest Journalist Fund. I mean, I know what's in the media, that's it, because I had nothing to do with it. But the vision here for those who are already delivering to the underserved, they're underserved by RNZ and TVNZ, but actually if you take the New Zealand Asian community, they're going somewhere else. They're getting news, they're getting services from private providers. How can the entity work with those commercial companies to actually support them to spread what they do? This entity, one of the first things that Deloitte, who's the establishment partner, has to do is do a heat map across New Zealand to say who's already delivering, but actually could benefit from a partnership with a new entity, so that if the entity could provide them with platforms, they could deliver wider to that group of New Zealanders. And that takes, the entity doesn't have to build everything. It's not to compete where people are already doing it. They're doing it well, but actually they could do with some support to do more. And that's part of what we're working on around the design, Melissa. Yeah. So I hope that works out.
We have some questions coming in. There's one from David Jacobs, who is a former BPM board member. Kia ora, David. Who says there are clearly issues of plurality in our media. So if a report says there are no issues, does that mean we shouldn't worry about it? I've actually put a link to the report. There's the Sapere report from MCH. I've put that up there. I have to say, as an academic researcher, I found some of its claims quite contentious. There are questions about how we understand plurality. There are questions about, is it just the number of media actors that are in a particular market, or does it represent the range of voices and the range of different positions that those voices might represent? So I think there are some complexities in that report. And I think I know why the Minister for Culture and Heritage might have treated it with some caution. Having said that, that's a testament to the fact that it was an independent report and clearly wasn't shaped by any particular interest. It was just an independent take on the issue.
But it was commissioned by MCH.
Yes, it was, and it's on their website.
Not about our work, agreeably. It was about the ecosystem, and
Indeed.
And again, I'll only speak about our work, but we absolutely, part of what we have been charged to do is to make sure that the ecosystem stays really, really healthy, because it's actually those beyond our borders that are more of a danger to that ecosystem than those that are in the ecosystem right now. So part of what we have to do is support the New Zealand ecosystem, both public media and the private media, to continue to be there for New Zealanders. So to make sure they're not overwhelmed by what's happening with the sort of global giants.
Yeah, I think we need to, I hope it's okay for me just to jump in, because Tracey's point leads in. I mean, I think we were talking about pluralism and plurality a minute ago. And I think perhaps the thing that's being overlooked a little bit is the trend and the tendency everywhere else toward media conglomeration. This is the problem that we're facing. We're a small country, and we have public radio and public television are the two key forms of media we're talking about. We need them strong enough to survive, let alone basically form a complementary pluralistic relationship with other public radio and other public television services in a small country. So we don't necessarily have a full range of services. In the UK, for instance, 60 million people, 62 million people, there's only one BBC, and it has radio and television in it. It has retained both of those key media services in it. It has been stronger for that. Of course, it's been publicly funded, so that has been an important resource that we've denied our public media. But I don't think we should focus too much on pluralism when we're talking about public radio and public television and their ability to survive in a situation where conglomerates are arriving on our shores as we speak. They're already here, but these are some of the largest media organizations in the world. The wealth and the resources they have could just wipe out our public broadcasting system if we do not do anything to protect it, right?
Okay, we have a question that's coming from our own Miles Thomas, particularly from Melissa, and that is, would she maintain the level of funding proposed by the Minister if she becomes the Minister of Broadcasting and Media in the future? And if not, why not?
Wow, that's a big question. Well, considering the fact that we're currently in a cost of living crisis, I can actually certainly see many better ways of actually using that money to build an infrastructure like this than yeah, I mean, if it was going purely to content, I would actually support it, but not for the infrastructure. As of what I would actually do, I have actually said publicly, look, as I said, I'm a supporter of local content, and I am a supporter of broadcasting. And regardless of what I actually think of both TVNZ and Radio New Zealand, and I'll be very interested to see what comes of it. I mean, I found Gavin's comment very interesting when he actually said, if it remains as TVNZ and RNZ, we've failed. And so I'm very interested to see where the PME actually takes the new entity and what it actually looks like. But because it doesn't actually get established until July 1st next year, I'm not so sure what it will actually look like. And I've always said, when we pour so much public money into something, I'm not just going to scrap it just because, we have a different view. I don't want to waste money. If it is actually a good idea, as I said to the Minister and also Tracey right at the beginning, if it's a good idea, of course, I'll support it.
Could I just jump in there, Melissa, and say that if you support local content, you obviously want that local content to have an outlet that people, where New Zealanders in particular can find it. Yeah. Is that correct? Would you want
but
that?
I don't think we should. I don't necessarily agree that it has to be just on, let's say, if it currently on TVNZ. If nobody watches TVNZ, what's the point of actually having local content on TVNZ? And if all of New Zealand is actually turning to another platform to watch local content, why not have the local content on another platform?
Well, then you'd use YouTube for that. But on the other hand, some forms of local content aren't viable to produce in a small country if you don't have an audience concentration to produce them for that is in fact located inside New Zealand. And that's really the basis upon which we've been proceeding for the last 30 years under the New Zealand on air system.
Could I just jump in? Melissa's absolutely right and been really responsible in her answer, because she hasn't seen, I haven't had the opportunity to come and see her since the cabinet decision to actually, and the terms of reference have just been confirmed. So I now have an opportunity to come to talk with her about what is the work we are doing and what is this going to look like out the other side. And we've made a decision that we want to be as transparent as possible until we can't. There'll be some things like budget things and that you just can't tell people. But so I think that's a really responsible response from Melissa, and I appreciate it. Thank you very much. And I need to get and see Melissa and give her an opportunity to know how we are going about our piece of work and what the steps are and at what stages we'll be able to come back and give her an update.
Thank you for that, Tracey.
Can I ask Melissa that question in a different way? Melissa, what would you do with the $306 million estimated commercial dividend that is going to be returned to the government by the entity? Now, I have real doubts about the 306 million, but my question to you is, would you continue a policy of returning revenue from the entity to Treasury, or would you prefer to see whatever money came out of its commercial operations reinvested in the entity itself?
Well, the 306 million, according to the budget, is an estimate, and it is for the next 6 years of the established PME. So that actually equates to about $51 million. And if the entity is not supposed to be as commercial, I doubt they will actually make $51 million in revenue. I'm not so sure how much they're going to make, but as I said, it will also depend on what kind of funding that whether they are able to access New Zealand On Air. There were talks that they won't be able to access New Zealand On Air. And when considering the fact that this budget, New Zealand On Air budget, was cut by $11 million, you sort of wonder. I would look at the money that the revenue that they actually earn going into local content. I would be, open to that. I think that would be a positive move.
Can I put a question now to Tracey about that? Because in the cabinet paper, Tracey, the government recommendation, and this is 20.2. Sorry, 20.1. And these have been accepted by cabinet, agree that to address possible concerns about the entity's impact on the broader sector, the entity's operating model should include 20.1 constraints on the entity's eligibility to act as a commissioning platform for content funded by NZ On Air. Now that says to me it won't be eligible for NZ On Air funding.
So there's a couple of things. You're right, that is in the cabinet paper because that came directly from the BCG report. One of the things that we wanted here, one of the concerns that was raised by content producers was that, or by lots of people, was that this thing would have complete control over the ecosystem and wipe everybody out. What we, and Trisha mentioned it before, we want to see more New Zealand content, not less New Zealand content and not the same New Zealand content. So one of the things that has still got to be finalised is, will this entity has more funding, not just the funding given by government. Can I just point out, I'm sorry, I don't think New Zealand On Air funding's been cut, Melissa. I'd have to go back and have a look at that, but I don't believe that's quite right. But this entity not only has, Thank you. And this entity not only has increased baseline funding from government, it's obviously getting the commercial revenue come across from TVNZ as well. So that will give it around a pot, I'm just going to be really approximate, of about 500 million. What the BCG recommended was that if there was direct funding, so that if direct funding didn't go through New Zealand On Air, but went directly to the entity, that the entity should not be able to directly pitch for more money from New Zealand On Air. The money that New Zealand On Air had must be left for other content producers, except in one circumstance, whether the entity, when the entity was the last platform that might show it. So if New Zealand On Air had a piece of content that they believed New Zealanders needed to see and they couldn't find another platform that would carry it, they could invite the new entity to carry that content. That's what we recommended. I don't see the ledge. We have got some ideas around it and we've had conversations about pieces of it, but the ledge is actually not part of our piece of work. So I'm sorry, I don't know exactly how that's fallen at the end of the day, Gavin.
Mhm.
Okay, well, we had a little poll. It appears that 57% of our group here don't have any concerns about government funding, although whether that means they're happy with the current amount or they want more, I'm not sure. 30% do though, and 13% may have concerns. So I think we've touched on quite an important issue there. I might chip in just for a moment and point out that there are different public policy rationales for funding media. I mean, for example, a lot of the money that goes into local content is vital for sustaining, you know, the sorts of media that represent New Zealand perspectives and New Zealand cultures, plural. But on the other hand, you can fund entirely commercial genres through New Zealand On Air, and genres that would never be, you know, recognised as a kind of a public service genre that was going above and beyond the commercial norm. So there's an interesting tension, I think, that arises when we try and look at the rationales for funding a public media entity that will serve us as citizens rather than as consumers, and one that's primarily there not only to provide content that we enjoy as consumers, but primarily there also to help industry survive. And indeed, the Public Interest Journalism Fund, although I think this was a very good idea, came out of a context where there was a recognition that many of the news media were struggling. And it was an attempt to try and make sure that during that very, very difficult period of COVID, with the lockdowns and the decline of advertising and retail spending, that they were given a helping hand. So there's funding and there's funding, and I think the funding that goes into New Zealand On Air to support the local production industry is important, but I also think it has a different sense of purpose from the funding that would go into RNZ or indeed now this new public media entity.
Yeah, that is true, and so there are different sort of criteria. And I think the other thing too, if we talk about resourcing, and I'd rather talk about resourcing when I talk about how the public media entity will support the ecosystem and the delivery of content to New Zealanders. And Melissa's absolutely right. The watchers of linear television are dropping like a rock. That's the reality of it. And manufacturers have entered into partnership with global content producers so that there will be it'll be really difficult if you buy a new smart TV to even find New Zealand content, right? So this entity is about making sure that we are putting content where New Zealanders are. And that may be Instagram, that may be YouTube, but we will also build our own platforms. And if we can resource, I think if we take Pacifica Radio Trust, delivering in multi-languages to many New Zealanders, if we resource to them with a platform, and while they're still getting funding from New Zealand On Air, how much more can they do when they don't have to pay now for a platform? So these are the relationships that this entity is going to have to build over the period of time once it becomes a real thing on the 1st of July 2023.
I'll just jump in because Tracey's been talking about the platform, and really, you know, when we talk about multi-platform, we've got to imagine something like a portal. you know, the word portal is often used overseas, not necessarily here, but a portal is larger than one platform. It's larger than one service. And if you can imagine, a couple of years ago, I was having a conversation with Chris Farfoy, and he had a vision. He would like to see, he said, New Zealand content available in one place. So this kind of goes to your interest in local content, Melissa, the idea that, you know, it will be possible in this new entity situation to find that content in one place, as well as finding it in other places, as Tracey just suggested. It's really important that there is also a place everybody knows where to look for it. And there they can find radio and television, obviously, but also the adjunct services, the services that Tracey, I think, was alluding to before, where we can work together, you know, where the public entity can provide a sort of a home, really, for smaller public media entities or services to live on, or to sort of collaborate with in terms of this portal. So I think you've got to imagine us having a place. You know, we need this place. We need this place in order to compete in any shape or form with the likes of Netflix, you know, HBO Max, Disney Plus, Amazon Prime Video. I mean, they're all coming. They're either here or they're on their way. You know, they're coming. So we need to watch out.
I think Trisha's raising a really important point about the architectures of content discovery in the digital world. I mean, this has become an incredibly valuable point of the value chain. The capacity not only to control content or have licensing rights over content, but the capacity to determine what audiences are able to discover. And it's very interesting, therefore, that in the UK, the new white paper on broadcasting has actually included provisions for prominence requirements, particularly for video on demand services, so that they're going to have to make local content, or in Europe for that matter, European-based content, highly visible on those platforms and in the interfaces and menus, you know, and program guides that direct that content. Now, I'm going to go to Melissa because she's had her hand up for some while. Melissa, do you want a response?
Thank you. I'll now lower my hand. I guess one of the comments that I would actually make was that, you know, we already had quite a lot of online platform visibility with things like Freeview, New Zealand On Demand. We've also got New Zealand On Screen, where a lot of the New Zealand contents are actually available online. And I think when Trisha actually says that, you know, the youth have actually sort of, you know, moved off to different platforms, I just have a question for Tracey and Trisha, I guess, who are actually on the board and in the working, gosh, I've forgotten the name of it. What'd you call it?
Trisha was on the business case, and I'm
business
on the
case group.
meeting.
Yes, business case as well. And now, Tracey, you are the chairperson of the establishment board. What different content will we actually see on the new public media entity that we don't currently?
Well, we can't answer that because that would be the job of the actual board of the entity and their CE. So we don't want to we're not getting as prescriptive as to tell them what content to do. So I can't answer the question. I can't answer the question, except what I hope you will see is I hope that my nieces who are of New Zealand Chinese descent will see more of themselves. I hope that my cousins who are of Māori descent will actually be able to see positive Māori programming across all of their public media, not just isolated off to Māori television. I'm hoping that, you know, the multitudes of New Zealanders who are of different ethnic backgrounds are able to see and hear themselves and know that they belong, and that those of us who don't know them very well get to know them better. That's what I hope.
I think
on Tracey, you mentioned Maori television. How tightly integrated into? I know it's not part of the new entity, but how close will the linkages be? Because a lot of the treaty implications and obligations on the entity could well be met through collaboration with Maori television. So where do you see that relationship sitting? I mean, one could have argued that it should have been part of the new entity. It's not, and I think that's gone, you know, water under the bridge. But how do you see that relationship between the two?
So while we were developing the business case, there was the Māori Media Shift Group of Minister Jackson was working on Māori media at the time.
Yeah.
So I had 2 meetings with the chair of that group, and the BCG actually had 2 meetings with members of the Māori Media Shift Group, so that we could draw them what we were envisaging, where we were going, how we saw things, and get their input into that. So at the moment, what I believe we are designing is an entity that Māori media, Māori television, iwi radio and so on can dock into. Again, how can this entity support them to do more of what they do? We also need to have more, if you think that Māori television has a mandate around te reo Māori, and so delivering content in te reo, there's also the capacity to work more closely for horizontal spread of content that might be created by the Māori media content producers to tell Māori stories or give a Māori perspective in English medium, so that there is a better understanding of history, of culture and so on across. So at the moment, there's a cabinet paper that's going up, but I don't know what's in it to do with Māori media. But so until that comes out the other side, what we're working on right now is creating an entity that Māori media can dock into and start to share content and be supported to do more of what they do.
That sort of relationship, of course, doesn't end with Maori content producers. You know, the way that you've been talking about the entity supporting others, that's a two-way process. They can support the entity as well. It shouldn't be a sort of a paternalistic relationship.
It's a relationship. It's a relationship. And at the end of the day, there's a couple of relationships, right? We have the Māori Crown relationship that we all carry. But actually then we're just talking about a relationship between really important entities here in New Zealand that deliver for New Zealanders. They deliver public media outcomes for New Zealanders. So this is a relationship.
Okay. I think we're moving into the final stages of our session this evening. Jeff, I see, has asked a question about Māori television, but I think Tracey's now answered that. There's also a question from Jeff Leland, who's also on the board of BPM. Kia ora, Jeff, asking whether there'll be an exploration of new ways of measuring audiences, not just in terms of the size, but in terms of satisfaction and appreciation. And Jeff suggests this is quite important, given that both TV ratings and radio surveys are increasingly inauthentic in our fragmented media environment.
Yeah. Sorry, Trisha, do you want to go?
Well, I'll have a go, Jeff. It's a hard one because obviously ratings themselves are becoming outmoded as a form of, for example, for television, ratings are sort of like yesterday's measurement system. So I don't see the new entity relying on that. I see the new entity being involved in developing and harnessing new ways to measure the audience, and obviously satisfaction and appreciation, given it's a public media entity, will be very, very much at the top of the list. Ratings will be a long way down the list. I don't even know if they'll be on the list, you know, honestly.
Well, so, and I'm just step in as well. So you're right, that the monitoring and the measuring has to be on the charter in the first instance. So how is it delivering to the charter? Now there's a question here in front of me, which is distracting. But so those are the charter itself has got some very definitive, but they're what I suppose people would call soft, as opposed to it's easy to count dollars and it's easy to count eyeballs, right? And some of what needs to be delivered by this entity cannot be decided if it's successful merely because you've got a bulk of people watching it, because they're underserved, maybe only a small community here in New Zealand, but they have the right to see themselves. So one of the things we are working on is the monitoring regime, and please, I hope you can hear from me that we certainly believe that measuring those soft success measures just as much as hard ones like dollars and eyeballs is really, really important.
Okay, thank you very much, Tracey. Well, we're pretty much up to time. There was a quick question from David Jacobs, mainly aimed at Melissa, about whether or not there was a democratic deficit in our current public media and broadcasting arrangements. I think we've possibly covered that theme in the wider discussion. Miles rather cheekily is asking who dared vote that there was too much money going into public media. Well, it turns out that we're out of time to answer that question, so the guilty parties don't need to put their hand up.
Oh, it wasn't me, that's for sure.
So I think
I didn't vote on any of them. I didn't vote on any of them. I didn't think it was fair that a current sitting politician should actually participate in the polling.
I should also say that the hosts from BPM aren't allowed to vote on the polls either. But on that note, I think we're going to have to call the proceedings to a halt. So a very, very big thank you to the Honourable Chris Farfoy. I'm very sorry we lost him slightly prematurely, but it was wonderful that he could join us and give the David Beatson Memorial Lecture. And to our panel, Melissa Lee, Tracey Martin, Dr. Gavin Ellis and Dr. Trisha Dunleavy. Very, very big thank you from Better Public Media, and indeed a big thank you to all our audience members who joined in this evening. So thank you very much for coming, and no doubt we'll be having more of these forums in the future. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Kia ora.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.